I'm Madison Thomas, 31 years old, and 6 months ago at my sister's graduation, my entire world imploded in the most public way imaginable. I thought the worst moment would be hearing my mother say, "Finally, one child made us proud," right in front of me. But what she did next was even worse. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this particular kind of heartbreak. Looking back now, I should have seen the signs earlier. But when you're raised in a family where love feels conditional, where praise is rationed like wartime supplies, you learn to collect crumbs and call them a feast. My story really begins 7 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday evening in downtown Portland. I was 24, working as a junior architect at a small firm, rushing through Pioneer Courthouse Square, with my portfolio clutched against my chest, when I literally collided with someone carrying an enormous coffee and a stack of legal briefs. The coffee went everywhere. His pristine white shirt was ruined, my portfolio got soaked, and instead of being angry, this man with kind brown eyes and the most genuine laugh I'd ever heard just started apologizing to me. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying, pulling napkins from his briefcase. I wasn't watching where I was going. I remember thinking that most people would have been furious, but Jake Martinez just smiled and asked if I was okay. He insisted on buying me a new coffee, even though I was the one who'd been practically sprinting through the square like someone was chasing me. We ended up talking for 3 hours at a little cafe called Stumptown, our damp papers spread across the small wooden table between us. He was a public defender, 3 years out of law school, passionate about helping people who couldn't afford good legal representation. I told him about my dreams of designing affordable housing, creating beautiful spaces for families who had been priced out of decent neighborhoods. He listened with this intense focus, asking questions that showed he actually understood what I was trying to achieve. When I mentioned that my family thought architecture was impractical, and that I should have studied something more stable, his expression darkened. "That's ridiculous," he said firmly. "The world needs people who care about making it more beautiful and accessible. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." It was the first time in my life someone had defended my dreams without me having to justify them first. Those early years with Jake felt like discovering color after living in black and white. He had this way of making ordinary moments feel special. Sunday morning farmers market trips, where he'd buy way too many peaches just because I mentioned I liked them. Spontaneous drives to the coast where we'd walk along Cannon Beach collecting smooth stones. Quiet evenings where he'd sketch building designs, while I read cases aloud to help him practice his arguments. He made me feel seen in ways my family never had. His own family embraced me immediately. His mother, Elena, would cook elaborate Sunday dinners and insist I take leftovers home in carefully labeled containers. His younger sister, Sophia, would text me architecture articles she found interesting, just because she knew I'd appreciate them. When I got promoted to senior designer after 2 years at the firm, Elena threw me a surprise party and gave a toast about how proud she was of her daughter-in-law-to-be. I remember crying in the bathroom afterward because I'd never experienced that kind of unconditional support. Jake and I moved in together after dating for 18 months, finding a small craftsman house in southeast Portland that needed work but had beautiful bones. We spent weekends refinishing hardwood floors and painting walls the exact shade of sage green I'd been dreaming about. He learned to make my favorite Thai curry because the local restaurant was too expensive for our budget, and I taught myself to iron his shirts properly because he hated paying for dry cleaning. We had this routine where he'd wake up first and bring me coffee in bed, and I'd read him interesting passages from whatever architecture book I was studying. By our 3rd year together, we'd settled into the kind of comfortable rhythm that felt like home. Jake would leave little notes in my lunch, terrible drawings of buildings with messages like "Hope your day is structurally sound," or "You're the foundation of my happiness." I'd surprise him with his favorite blackberry scones from the bakery down the street when he was working on particularly difficult cases. We'd spend Friday nights cooking elaborate meals and Saturday mornings sleeping late, talking about the house we'd buy someday, the kids we'd have, the nonprofit I wanted to start designing homes for homeless families. I was genuinely happy during this period in a way I'd never experienced before. My career was flourishing. I designed a small community center that won a local award, and several affordable housing developers were seeking out my work. Jake and I had started talking seriously about marriage, looking at rings, and discussing when might be the right time. We felt financially stable for the first time, emotionally connected, surrounded by friends who genuinely cared about us. I remember thinking that this must be what normal families felt like, this sense of being loved unconditionally, of having people who celebrated your successes without jealousy or conditions. But during this golden period, there were small signs I chose to ignore. My family's phone calls became less frequent, and when I did talk to them, conversations felt strained. When I'd share good news about work or my relationship, there would be these long pauses followed by comments like, "That's nice, dear," or "I hope you're being practical about your future." My sister Carmen was finishing her master's program in business at Northwestern, and every family conversation somehow circled back to her internships, her grades, her networking successes. I told myself it was natural. She was younger, still in school, needed more support. When Jake asked if my family would want to meet his parents over Christmas, my stomach clenched in a way I pretended not to notice. I made excuses about scheduling conflicts and travel expenses, but the truth was, I dreaded the thought of my family meeting people who actually liked me. What if they saw the difference? What if Jake realized how differently his family treated me compared to my own? The morning of Carmen's graduation from Northwestern started ordinarily enough. I woke up early in our little Portland house. Jake still sleeping beside me, sunlight streaming through the white curtains we'd hung together the previous spring. I made coffee in the French press he'd given me for my birthday, and sat on our small back porch, checking my phone for flight updates. I was flying to Chicago alone. Jake had offered to come, but I'd convinced him he couldn't miss work for what I called just another graduation. Looking back, I realize I was protecting him from witnessing what I knew was coming. My family had been clear about their expectations for this weekend. Carmen was graduating summa cum laude with her MBA, had already accepted a position at a prestigious consulting firm in Manhattan, and was being inducted into some honor society I'd never heard of. This was their moment to celebrate the child who had made smart choices and focused on what really matters. The subtext was obvious. Unlike me with my artistic career and boyfriend, they'd met exactly twice. I chose my outfit carefully that morning. A navy blue dress that looked professional but not too formal, pearl earrings my grandmother had left me, low heels that wouldn't make me taller than Carmen in her graduation photos. I'd learned over the years to make myself smaller at family events, to take up less space so there was more room for their pride in my sister. The flight to Chicago was turbulent, which felt appropriately symbolic. I spent most of it staring out the window at cloud formations, practicing conversations in my head where I deflected questions about my plans for the future and redirected attention back to Carmen. I had a speech prepared about how proud I was of my sister, how excited I was about her new job, how the whole family must feel so fulfilled watching her succeed. But as the plane descended through gray clouds toward O'Hare, I felt this growing knot in my stomach that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the usual family anxiety, this felt different, heavier, like something was about to fundamentally change. I remember gripping the armrest and thinking that maybe I should have brought Jake after all, that facing my family alone suddenly felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. What I didn't know then was that this graduation would become the moment everything I thought I understood about my family would shatter completely, leaving me to rebuild my understanding of love, loyalty, and what it really means to belong somewhere. The Illinois Institute of Technology campus buzzed with the energy of families celebrating their graduates. Parents posed for photos near blooming cherry trees, siblings hugged in caps and gowns, grandparents beamed with pride at ceremonies that marked years of hard work finally paying off. I watched these moments of genuine joy as I walked toward the designated meeting spot, my chest tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name. My family dynamics had been established long before I was old enough to understand them. My parents, Robert and Linda Thomas, had married young and built their entire identity around being practical people who made smart decisions. Dad worked in insurance, Mom taught high school math, and they approached parenting like a business plan with measurable outcomes. Carmen, born when I was 6, seemed to intuitively understand the family currency of achievement and approval. She excelled at everything: academics, piano lessons, debate team, student government. She chose activities that looked good on college applications and selected friends whose parents had respectable careers. I, on the other hand, had always been the family puzzle. Even as a child, I was drawn to art, to building elaborate structures with blocks, to sketching buildings I imagined living in someday. When other kids played house, I designed the house first, carefully considering window placement and room flow. My parents treated these interests as cute phases I'd eventually outgrow in favor of more realistic goals. I remember being 12 and showing my parents a drawing I'd made of a community center with a rooftop garden, excited about the idea of creating spaces where people could gather and grow food together. Dad looked at it briefly and said, "That's nice, Madison, but you need to focus on subjects that will actually pay the bills." Mom added, "Art is a wonderful hobby, but we want you to have security." Carmen, only 6 at the time, was praised that same week for expressing interest in business after watching Dad review insurance policies. This pattern continued through high school. Carmen's honor roll certificates went on the refrigerator, my portfolio pieces were relegated to my bedroom. When Carmen won the state debate championship, the whole family drove 5 hours to watch her compete. When I was selected for a summer architecture program at Portland State, I was told it was too expensive and probably not worth missing summer work opportunities. College selection revealed the full extent of the disparity. Carmen was encouraged to apply to top-tier business programs regardless of cost, with promises that education is an investment in your future. When I wanted to study architecture, every conversation centered on expense, practicality, and backup plans. I ended up at Portland State on partial scholarship, working 30 hours a week to cover living expenses, while Carmen attended Northwestern with full family financial support and weekly care packages. The support system I built in Portland came from recognizing what unconditional love actually looked like. Jake's friends became my friends, people who celebrated each other's successes without keeping score, who offered help without expecting anything in return, who showed up during difficult times just because they cared. My colleagues at the architecture firm mentored me not because it benefited them, but because they genuinely wanted to see me succeed. I remember the evening Jake met my parents for the first time, 2 years into our relationship. We'd driven to Seattle for a weekend visit, and I'd spent the entire drive coaching him on family dynamics. "Don't mention the awards I've won," I said, "and try not to seem too enthusiastic about my work. They find that overwhelming." He looked at me with such confusion and concern, but agreed to follow my lead. The dinner was exactly as awkward as I'd anticipated. My parents asked Jake polite questions about his job, but seemed most interested in his financial prospects and whether he was encouraging me to be more practical about my career. When he spoke passionately about public defense work and creating justice for people who couldn't afford private attorneys, they nodded politely but clearly viewed his idealism as naive. When I mentioned a housing project I was particularly proud of, Dad changed the subject to Carmen's latest internship accomplishment. That night, lying in the guest room bed that had been mine through high school, Jake whispered, "Do they always treat you like that?" I pretended not to know what he meant, but his question lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest where I couldn't ignore it. The crisis that would define everything began with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing blueprints for a low-income housing development when my phone rang, Carmen's name flashing on the screen. She never called me directly. Our communication usually happened through family group texts or brief conversations during visits home. "Madison," she said, her voice tight with stress I'd never heard before. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise not to tell Mom and Dad yet." My immediate reaction was protective. Despite our complicated dynamic, she was still my little sister. I set down my pencils and gave her my full attention. What she told me changed everything. I thought I understood about our family. During her final semester at Northwestern, Carmen had been struggling with severe anxiety and depression. The pressure to maintain perfect grades while networking and interviewing for prestigious jobs had become overwhelming. She'd started having panic attacks during exams, crying herself to sleep most nights, unable to eat or concentrate. "I've been seeing a counselor through the student health center," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She thinks I need to take medical leave to address what she calls perfectionism-induced anxiety disorder. I might not be able to graduate on time." I felt simultaneously heartbroken for her and angry at the system that had created this pressure. "Carmen, I'm so sorry you've been going through this alone. Have you talked to Mom and Dad?" "That's the problem," she said. And I could hear her crying now. I tried to bring it up last week, to prepare them for the possibility that graduation might be delayed. "Do you know what Dad said?" She took a shaky breath. "He said, 'You'll figure it out. Our family doesn't believe in giving up when things get difficult.'" The implications hit me like a physical blow. Our parents, who had spent years celebrating Carmen's achievements while dismissing my own, were now minimizing her genuine mental health crisis because it threatened their image of the successful daughter. Over the following weeks, Carmen and I talked more honestly than we ever had before. She revealed that she'd always felt enormous pressure to be the good daughter because she could see how disappointed our parents were in my choices. "I thought if I succeeded enough, it would balance out their frustration with you," she said during one late-night conversation. "But it never felt like enough. Every achievement just raised the bar higher." I shared my own experiences of feeling invisible and unsupported, of learning to seek validation elsewhere because none was available at home. For the first time, we recognized that we'd both been victims of our parents' conditional love, she as the golden child who could never live up to impossible expectations, me as the scapegoat who absorbed their disappointment. Carmen decided to prioritize her mental health and take the medical leave her counselor recommended. This meant she'd graduate in a smaller ceremony the following semester, missing the big spring commencement our parents had been planning to attend for months. When she finally told them, their reaction was exactly what she'd feared. "We're very disappointed in you," Mom said during a family video call I wasn't supposed to be part of but overheard through Carmen's phone. "We've already made arrangements to be there, told all our friends about your graduation. What will we tell people?" Dad added, "This is exactly the kind of giving up that leads to a lifetime of mediocrity. Successful people push through difficult periods instead of making excuses." After hanging up, Carmen called me sobbing. "They're more worried about explaining my absence to their friends than they are about my actual well-being," she said. How did I never see this before? But the most shocking revelation came when Carmen told me what our parents had decided to do about the graduation ceremony they'd planned to attend. Instead of supporting her decision and waiting for her makeup ceremony, they were still coming to Northwestern's main graduation weekend. "They want to attend anyway," Carmen said. Her voice hollow. Mom said since they'd already made the travel arrangements and told people they were going, they didn't want to waste the opportunity to see what Carmen should have accomplished. The knife twisted deeper when Carmen revealed the rest of their plan. "They asked if you could fly in too so it wouldn't be a total loss of a weekend. Mom said maybe we could have a nice family dinner and discuss your future plans since they'd have you as a captive audience." I felt something crystallize in my chest in that moment, a clarity I'd been avoiding for years. Our parents weren't just unsupportive, they were actively harmful. They were using Carmen's mental health crisis as an opportunity to ambush me with criticism, treating our pain as inconveniences to their social calendar. This was when I began planning what I now think of as my liberation. If they wanted a family gathering to discuss my future, I'd give them exactly that. But it wouldn't be the conversation they were expecting. The first scene of my awakening happened 3 days after Carmen's confession. My parents called me directly for the first time in months, their voices bright with the kind of false cheer I'd learned to recognize as manipulation. "Madison, we have wonderful news." Mom's voice carried that artificially enthusiastic tone she used when she wanted something. "We're still going to Northwestern this weekend for what would have been Carmen's graduation. We thought this would be a perfect opportunity for some family time." I let the silence stretch, waiting for the real agenda. Dad picked up the thread. "Your mother and I have been talking, and we realize we don't spend enough time focusing on your future. This could be a chance to really discuss where you're heading professionally, maybe help you make some more strategic decisions." The word strategic landed like a slap. In family code, this meant they wanted to convince me to abandon architecture and pursue something they considered more respectable. I'd heard variations of this conversation my entire adult life, but something felt different now. Sharper, more desperate. "We've already booked the hotel," Mom continued. "We thought you could fly in Friday evening, and we could have a nice dinner Saturday night after attending the ceremony. You know, since we're already there and everything." The casual cruelty of planning to attend a graduation ceremony for a daughter who wasn't graduating, while using the weekend to ambush their other daughter, struck me as so perfectly emblematic of their dysfunction that I almost laughed. "The graduation ceremony?" I asked carefully. "But Carmen won't be there." "Well, no," Dad's voice carried a hint of irritation. "But we've already told people we were attending. And Northwestern has an excellent business program. We thought it might be inspiring for you to see what real academic achievement looks like." There it was, the not-so-subtle implication that my own college experience had been insufficient, that I needed to be shown examples of real success to understand my own failures. During that conversation, sitting in my Portland office surrounded by architectural drawings and project photos, I made a decision that would change everything. I agreed to come to Chicago, but I also began planning something they weren't expecting. I spent the next week researching exactly what I wanted to say and gathering documentation of my actual professional accomplishments. My firm had recently been featured in a national magazine for our affordable housing work. I'd won several regional awards for sustainable design. I'd been invited to speak at conferences about community-centered architecture. My work was making a difference in people's lives in ways my parents had never bothered to learn about. The second escalation came during our Friday evening dinner at a generic hotel restaurant near Northwestern's campus. The decor was all beige and burgundy, designed to offend no one and inspire no one, which felt appropriate for a conversation I knew would be both bland and devastating. My parents had clearly prepared talking points. Over appetizers, they began what I now recognize as a coordinated intervention. "Madison, we love you very much." Mom began using the tone she'd once used to explain why I couldn't have a dog. "But we're concerned about your long-term stability." Dad nodded sagely. "Architecture is a very competitive field, and frankly we're not sure you have what it takes to really succeed in it long-term." I took a sip of wine and waited for them to reveal their real agenda. "We've been doing some research," Mom continued, pulling out printed pages from her purse. "Did you know that only 30% of architecture graduates are still working in the field after 10 years? And the median income is significantly lower than other professional careers requiring similar education investments." The fact that they'd researched statistics about my career field would have been touching if it had come from a place of genuine interest rather than ammunition for their argument. "We think you should consider transitioning into something more stable," Dad said. "Maybe project management or real estate development. You could use your design background but move into the business side of things." As they talked, laying out their vision of my more practical future, I watched other families in the restaurant. A couple celebrating their daughter's medical school acceptance. Parents toasting their son's engagement. Grandparents looking through photos of grandchildren with pure joy. Normal families, sharing normal moments of pride and love. My parents weren't interested in my happiness or fulfillment. They were embarrassed by my choices and wanted to reshape me into someone they could brag about to their friends. "What about Jake?" I asked, curious how he figured into their plans for my life. Mom and Dad exchanged glances I'd seen 1,000 times before. "Jake seems like a nice young man," Mom said carefully. "But public defense work isn't exactly lucrative. If you're planning a future together, someone needs to be the practical one financially. Have you two discussed marriage seriously?" Dad asked. "Because if you're going to have children someday, you'll need to think about stability, college funds, retirement planning." The implication was clear: Jake wasn't good enough either. His passion for justice and helping people was viewed as another impractical choice. Another mark against both of us in their assessment of what constituted a worthy life. I realized in that moment that nothing I could ever achieve in architecture would satisfy them, because the problem wasn't my career success. The problem was that I'd chosen a path that prioritized meaning over money, community impact over individual advancement, creativity over conformity. These weren't values they understood or respected. "We just want what's best for you," Mom said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "We want you to have security." But sitting there, listening to them plan my life around their anxieties and social expectations, I understood that what they called security was actually a prison. They wanted me to abandon everything that made me feel alive and fulfilled in exchange for their approval that might never come anyway. The third escalation happened Saturday morning when they insisted I accompany them to Northwestern's graduation ceremony. Carmen was obviously not participating, but they were determined to attend anyway. "It'll be good for you to see what you could have achieved with different choices," Dad said as we walked across campus. The ceremony was beautiful in the way college graduations always are, full of hope and possibility, families celebrating years of hard work finally paying off. But watching it with my parents felt surreal and cruel. They were using someone else's children's achievements to make me feel inadequate about my own life. During the business school recognition portion of the ceremony, Mom leaned over and whispered, "Carmen should have been walking across that stage right now." Her voice carried equal parts sadness and accusation, as if I were somehow responsible for my sister's mental health struggles. When the dean spoke about the business graduates going on to leadership positions in Fortune 500 companies, Dad nudged me and said, "This is what real career advancement looks like." I watched families around us cheering for their graduates, taking photos, crying with pride, and felt the full weight of how different my experience was. These parents were celebrating their children's accomplishments. Mine were using the ceremony as a teaching tool to highlight my failures. But the moment that broke something open in me came when a graduate was recognized for her work in sustainable architecture and community development. The dean spoke about her innovative designs for homeless housing and her commitment to social justice through environmental design. "Now that's someone who's using her architecture degree properly," Mom whispered approvingly. "She's making a real difference." The irony was so complete I almost laughed out loud. This graduate was doing exactly the work I was already doing in Portland. My parents just had never bothered to learn enough about my actual career to recognize it. After the ceremony, as we walked back toward their hotel, I finally asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What exactly would make you proud of me?" They exchanged that look again. "We'd be proud if you made choices that showed you were thinking about your future practically." Dad said, "We'd be proud if you found work that offered real financial security and growth potential." Mom added, "We'd be proud if you settled down with someone who could provide stability for a family." Dad continued, "I listened to their list of conditions for earning their love and realized they weren't describing me at all. They were describing the daughter they wished they'd had instead of the one they actually had." That evening, over dinner at an upscale steakhouse they'd chosen to mark what they called serious family discussion time, they presented their final argument with the kind of preparation usually reserved for business presentations. Mom opened a leather portfolio and pulled out printed documents. "We've been thinking about this for a long time," she said, "and we want to make you a proposition." The proposition was breathtaking in its audacity. They'd researched MBA programs that accepted students with undergraduate architecture degrees. They'd identified several business schools that offered concentrations in real estate development or construction management. They'd even looked into potential career paths that would utilize my creative background while providing real earning potential. "We're prepared to pay for your graduate education," Dad said, his voice carrying the tone of someone announcing a generous gift. "Full tuition, living expenses, everything. But only if you pursue something practical." The papers included program descriptions, admission requirements, potential salary ranges, and career trajectories. They'd spent considerable time and effort planning my life transition down to specific details. "Think about it," Mom said earnestly. "You could be earning 6 figures within 5 years of graduation. You could buy a real house, not just rent. You could provide security for your future children." As they laid out their vision, I realized this wasn't really about my happiness or success. This was about their ability to tell friends and colleagues about their daughter's impressive career and income. They wanted me to become someone they could brag about. "What about my current work?" I asked. "The projects I'm already committed to." Dad waved this away dismissively. "You're young enough to make a change. The sooner you start over in the right direction, the less time you'll waste." The word waste hung in the air like smoke. 7 years of building a career I loved, developing expertise in sustainable design, creating homes for families who needed them. All of it was waste in their assessment. "And Jake?" I asked. "If he really loves you, he'll support you making smart choices for your future." Mom said. "And if he doesn't support you improving yourself, well, that tells you something about his character, doesn't it?" The manipulation was so elegant, I almost admired its sophistication. They were questioning Jake's worthiness based on whether he'd support me abandoning everything I cared about to pursue their vision of success. As they continued presenting their case, complete with printouts and research and financial projections, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't love or support or concern for my well-being. This was a hostile takeover of my life, wrapped in parental worry and tied up with conditional affection. "We need an answer by the end of the weekend," Dad said finally. "The application deadlines for next year's programs are coming up soon." They'd planned this entire weekend as an ultimatum. Come to Chicago, listen to their presentation, and choose between my authentic life and their approval. The timing wasn't accidental. They'd waited until Carmen was vulnerable and absent to corner me when I'd have no family support. That night, lying in my sterile hotel room, I called Jake. It was late in Portland, but he answered immediately. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice warm with concern. I told him everything. The graduation ceremony for Carmen who wasn't graduating. The research they'd done into alternative careers for me. The offer to pay for business school if I abandoned architecture. The deadline they'd imposed for my decision. Jake was quiet for a long time after I finished talking. "Madison," he said, "finally, you know this is insane." Right, hearing him say it out loud. That my family's behavior was actually insane. Not just difficult or complicated. Felt like permission to trust my own perceptions. They're asking you to throw away everything you've worked for. Everything you love, everything you're good at, he continued. And they're calling it love. That's not love. That's control. We talked until 3 in the morning. And by the time we hung up, I knew exactly what I was going to do. But first, I needed to understand one more thing about my family's motivations. The final escalation came Sunday morning over brunch at the hotel restaurant. My parents were clearly expecting an answer to their proposition, their faces bright with anticipation. "We hope you've had time to really think about everything we discussed," Mom said, buttering her croissant with careful precision. "We have," Dad added, "because we love you and want to see you succeed." I decided to test something. "Before I give you my answer," I said, "I want to understand something. What specifically about my current career bothers you most?" They exchanged glances, clearly prepared for this question. "It's not that we don't appreciate your creativity," Mom began carefully. "It's just that architecture is so uncertain. You're dependent on other people's budgets and priorities. You can't control your income or growth the way you could in business. And frankly," Dad added, "it's difficult to explain to people what you actually do. When I tell colleagues my daughter is an architect, they ask if you design office buildings or houses for rich people. When I explain that you work on, what do you call it, low-income housing, they don't really understand why someone would choose that." There it was. The truth beneath all their practical concerns. They were embarrassed by work that didn't fit their social circle's definition of prestige. They couldn't brag about my career because it didn't translate to easy status markers. "What about Jake?" I asked. "What specifically concerns you about him?" "He seems like a good person," Mom said, diplomatically. "But public defense work is essentially a dead-end career. He'll never make enough money to provide real security for a family. And he enables your idealistic tendencies," Dad added. "Instead of encouraging you to think practically about your future, he supports these projects that don't lead anywhere financially." I felt something crystallize in that moment. They didn't just disapprove of my choices. They actively resented that I'd found happiness and fulfillment in ways they couldn't understand or control. "So," I said carefully, "if I changed careers and broke up with Jake, then you'd be proud of me. If you made smart choices and found someone who could provide real stability, yes," Dad said without hesitation. "We'd be very proud. Even if I was miserable?" I asked. Mom looked genuinely confused by the question. "Why would you be miserable if you were successful and secure?" In that moment, I understood that we were speaking completely different languages. To them, success and security automatically generated happiness. The idea that I could be fulfilled by meaningful work that didn't maximize income, or loved by someone who prioritized justice over wealth, was not just foreign but actively threatening to their worldview. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I'd prepared. "Before I respond to your offer," I said, "I want to show you something." I spread out copies of magazine articles featuring my work, award certificates, photos of housing projects I'd designed, letters from families who'd moved into homes I'd created. I'd brought documentation of everything I'd accomplished in my career. The real accomplishments they'd never bothered to learn about. "This is what I actually do," I said. "This is the work you want me to abandon." They looked through the materials with expressions I couldn't quite read. Surprise maybe, or confusion. "This is impressive," Mom said slowly. "But Madison, these are just feel-good projects. What about your long-term financial planning?" Even confronted with evidence of my professional success and community impact, they couldn't shift their fundamental framework. Achievement only counted if it generated the kind of wealth and status they could understand. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Carmen isn't graduating this weekend because she's been having panic attacks and depression from trying to live up to impossible expectations. She's in therapy, working on healing from the pressure to be perfect that's been destroying her mental health. Their faces went rigid. And I need to tell you something else. I continued. I'm not going to business school. I'm not changing careers. I'm not breaking up with Jake. I'm not going to rearrange my entire life to earn approval that should have been unconditional from the beginning. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Madison, Dad said finally, his voice carrying warning. You're making a serious mistake. The only mistake I've made, I replied, is waiting this long to say this. The confrontation that followed would define the next phase of my relationship with my family forever. The hotel restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of other families finishing their weekend visits, saying goodbyes after graduation celebrations, making plans for future gatherings. At our corner table, however, a different kind of conversation was about to unfold. My parents sat across from me. The evidence of my professional achievements spread between us like a challenge. Dad's jaw was set in the expression I remembered from childhood moments when I'd pushed back against their expectations. Mom's hands were folded tightly, her wedding ring catching the morning light streaming through the large windows. Madison, Mom began, her voice taking on the careful tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while delivering ultimatums. I think you're being emotional about this. These are practical decisions that will affect the rest of your life. I'm not being emotional, I replied, keeping my voice level. I'm finally being honest. Dad leaned forward, his insurance salesman instincts kicking in. Let's think about this logically. You're 31 years old. If you want to have children, you need to start planning for that financially. Architecture might feel fulfilling now, but can it support a family? The families living in homes I've designed seem to be doing fine, I said. That's not what I mean. And you know it. Dad's voice carried irritation now. I mean real financial security. College funds, retirement savings, emergency funds, adult responsibilities. The word adult hit like a slap. In their framework, pursuing meaningful work instead of maximizing income was inherently childish, irresponsible, naive. What about Jake? Mom asked, shifting tactics. Have you discussed these concerns with him? Does he understand the financial pressure you'll face trying to build a future on two helping people's careers? The air quotes around helping people revealed everything about how they viewed both Jake's work and mine. Public defense and affordable housing design weren't real careers to them. They were extended adolescent fantasies that prevented us from joining the adult world of serious financial planning. Jake and I have discussed our future extensively, I said. We're both committed to work that makes a difference, and we're both willing to live within our means to do it. Living within your means is fine when you're young, Dad said, his voice rising slightly. But what about when you want to buy a house? What about when you have children who need things? What about when you're 50 and realize you have no retirement savings? As he spoke, his face flushed with genuine agitation. This wasn't just about my choices anymore. My resistance to their plan was challenging something fundamental about how they understood success and security. We're offering to pay for graduate school. Mom interjected, her voice taking on a pleading quality. Do you know how much that's worth? How many people would kill for that opportunity? The opportunity to abandon everything I care about, I asked. The opportunity to set yourself up for real success. Dad's voice cracked with frustration. Madison, we're not asking you to become someone you're not. We're asking you to become the best version of yourself. There it was, the fundamental delusion underlying everything. They genuinely believed that the best version of me was the version that would generate income and status they could understand. My authentic self, with all my actual achievements and happiness, was somehow the inferior version that needed improvement. I looked around the restaurant again, at families saying loving goodbyes after celebrating their children's accomplishments, and felt the full weight of how different my experience was. Tell me something, I said, my voice quiet but steady. Can you name one thing about my actual work that you're proud of? They exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this question. We're proud that you're creative, Mom said slowly. We're proud that you're working, Dad added. We just want you to work smarter. Can you name a specific project I've designed? Can you tell me about any of the families who've moved into homes I've created? Can you explain what sustainable architecture means, or why it matters? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Madison, we're not architects, Mom said defensively. We can't be expected to understand all the technical details. I'm not asking about technical details, I replied. I'm asking if you've ever been curious enough about my life to learn anything about what I actually do with my days. Dad's face was darkening with the kind of anger I remembered from childhood moments when I'd asked questions that revealed uncomfortable truths. We know enough to see that it's not sustainable long term, he said sharply. We know enough to worry about your future financial security. We know enough to see that you're wasting your potential. And Jake, I pressed. Can you tell me anything about his work that matters to you? He helps criminals avoid consequences for their actions, Dad said, his voice carrying disgust. He enables people who've made bad choices to escape responsibility. The mischaracterization was so complete, so willfully ignorant, that I almost laughed. He ensures that people who can't afford attorneys get fair representation in the legal system, I corrected. He protects constitutional rights for everyone, not just people who can pay for expensive lawyers. That's a very idealistic way to look at it, Mom said dismissively. That's an accurate way to look at it, I replied. The conversation was spiraling exactly where I'd expected it to go. Every attempt I made to help them understand the work Jake and I actually did was met with dismissal, reframing, or outright hostility. They weren't interested in learning about our actual lives. They were interested in convincing us to abandon those lives in favor of versions they could respect. Madison, Dad said, his voice taking on the tone he'd used when I was a teenager refusing to clean my room, you're being stubborn about this. We're trying to help you and you're acting like we're the enemy. I don't think you're the enemy, I said carefully. I think you love me in the way you know how, but I also think your love comes with conditions I can't meet without destroying everything that makes me happy. Happiness is a luxury, Mom said sharply. Security comes first. You can't be happy if you're worried about money all the time. I'm not worried about money all the time, I replied. I live within my means. I save what I can. And I find joy in work that matters to me. That feels like a pretty good life. Until you want children, Dad said, playing what he clearly thought was his trump card. Until you want to buy a house in a good school district. Until you want to take family vacations or pay for college or any of the things that require real money. I realized in that moment that no amount of evidence about my current happiness and success would matter to them because they fundamentally believed that any happiness built on my current foundation was temporary and naive. What if I told you, I said, that Jake and I are already planning to have children? That we've discussed education costs and family budgets and all the practical considerations you're worried about? On 2 idealistic salaries? Mom asked skeptically. On 2 salaries that might not be huge but are stable and growing in fields we care about, I corrected. Madison, Dad said, his voice heavy with what I recognized as his final argument tone. We've lived longer than you have. We understand things about financial planning and life expenses that you don't understand yet. We're trying to save you from making mistakes that will hurt you for decades. And there it was. The fundamental premise underlying everything. I was too naive. Too young, too idealistic to understand my own life. My actual experience of happiness and fulfillment was irrelevant because they knew better than I did about what would ultimately make me happy. I pulled out my phone and opened the Photos app. I want to show you something, I said, scrolling to pictures of the community center I'd designed for a neighborhood that had lost its gathering space to gentrification. This is the Montevilla Community Center in Portland. I designed it after 2 years of community meetings, listening to families talk about what they needed. I showed them photos of the building, the grand opening celebration, children playing in the carefully designed outdoor space, elderly residents taking classes in the flexible meeting rooms. This building serves 800 families, I continued. It has a commercial kitchen where people can start food businesses, a computer lab where kids do homework after school, meeting spaces where the community organizes for better city services. They looked at the photos politely but without engagement. That's very nice, Mom said. But Madison, you can't base a career on feeling good about helping people. You need to think about your own future. I scrolled to more photos. Housing developments I designed, families moving into new homes, ribbon-cutting ceremonies where city officials praised the innovative design solutions that made affordable housing beautiful and sustainable. This is what I do, I said. This is the impact my work has on the world. And you want me to give it up to sell real estate or manage construction projects for profit margins. We want you to use your talents in ways that will also benefit you financially. Dad said, his patience clearly wearing thin. There's nothing wrong with making money while helping people. But that's not what you're asking for, I replied. You're asking me to prioritize making money over helping people. You're asking me to choose financial growth over community impact. We're asking you to be practical. Mom's voice rose enough that other diners glanced in our direction. We're asking you to think about your future instead of just your feelings. I felt something settle in my chest. A clarity I'd been building toward for years. I need to tell you both something, I said. My voice steady despite my racing heart. I've been thinking about my future constantly. Jake and I talk about it every week. We have savings goals. We've researched neighborhoods where we want to buy a house. We've planned how we'll balance careers and parenting when we have children. They stared at me, clearly unprepared for this level of concrete planning. We've also talked about our families, I continued. And we've both realized that we want to raise children who value kindness and community impact over income and status. We want kids who choose careers they're passionate about rather than careers that impress other people. Madison, Dad said, his voice carrying warning. We want our children to have grandparents who love them unconditionally, I said, looking directly at both my parents. Grandparents who celebrate their achievements without comparing them to arbitrary standards. Grandparents who are curious about their interests instead of trying to reshape them into someone else. The implication hung in the air like smoke. And if that's not possible, I said, quietly, we want our children protected from the kind of conditional love that makes kids feel like they're never enough exactly as they are. Mom's face went pale. Dad's jaw tightened until I could see the muscles jumping. Are you threatening us? Dad asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm telling you what kind of grandparents our children will have access to, I replied. The kind who love them as they are, or no grandparents at all. The words settled between us like a boundary line drawn in sand. Madison, Mom said, her voice shaking slightly. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Madison, Mom said, her voice now carrying the kind of careful control I recognized from every major family crisis of my childhood, I think you need to take some time to really consider what you're saying. She reached across the table, as if to take my hand, but I pulled it back. I've had years to consider this, I replied. Every family gathering, where my achievements were dismissed. Every conversation where you tried to convince me my life choices were mistakes. Every time you've met Jake and treated him like he's not good enough for me because he prioritizes justice over profit. We've never said Jake wasn't good enough, Dad protested. You've never said he was good enough either, I replied. You've spent 2 years analyzing his earning potential and finding it insufficient. Because we want you to have security. Mom's voice cracked with frustration. Because we love you and want you to be safe and stable and not struggle financially. But you've never asked me if I feel safe and stable, I said. You've never asked if I'm struggling financially. You've just assumed that because my life doesn't look like yours, it must be inadequate. I pulled out another document from my folder. My tax returns from the previous year. This is what I actually earned last year, I said, sliding the paper across to them. This is what struggling in architectures actually looks like. They looked at the numbers, and I watched their expressions shift as they processed information that clearly surprised them. This is more than we expected. Mom said slowly. This is what happens when you're good at your job and you build a reputation in your field, I replied. This is what wasting my potential actually generates. Dad studied the tax forms with the careful attention of someone who understood financial documents professionally. But this is just 1 year, he said finally. Architecture is cyclical. What about during recessions? What about when the economy slows down? What about when insurance companies downsize during recessions? I countered. What about when school districts cut teaching positions during budget crises? No career is immune to economic uncertainty. But some careers are more stable than others. Mom insisted. And some careers provide more meaning than others, I replied. Some careers contribute to solving social problems instead of just generating individual wealth. You can't live on meaning, Dad said sharply. But you can't live without it either, I responded. And the evidence is sitting right in front of you that I'm living on considerably more than meaning. They looked at the tax documents again, and I could see them recalibrating their entire argument. Jake's income is also higher than you've assumed. I continued. Public defenders in Portland start at higher salaries than in most places, and he's been promoted twice. Between the two of us, we're doing fine financially. But what about long-term growth potential? Dad asked, grasping for remaining objections. What about long-term happiness potential? I countered. What about the value of doing work that makes the world better? What about the importance of feeling fulfilled by how you spend your days? You can feel fulfilled in any career if you approach it right, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. Can you? I asked. Do you feel fulfilled by your careers? The question caught them off guard. We feel satisfied, Dad said carefully. We've provided well for our family. But do you feel excited about your work? Do you wake up looking forward to your days? Do you feel like you're making a positive impact? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Not everyone gets to have a job they're passionate about, Mom said finally. Most people work to live, not live to work. But some people do get to have both, I replied. And I'm one of them. Jake is one of them. Why would we give that up? I could see them struggling with a fundamental challenge to their worldview. They'd built their entire understanding of success around sacrifice. Trading passion for security, meaning for money, fulfillment for stability. The idea that these trades weren't always necessary threatened something central to how they'd justified their own choices. Even if you're making good money now, Dad said, returning to familiar ground. What about retirement planning? What about building generational wealth? What about leaving something for your children? What about leaving them a model of how to find work they love? I asked. What about showing them that success isn't just about accumulating money? What about teaching them to prioritize community contribution over individual advancement? That's very idealistic, Mom said. But children need practical advantages too. Children need parents who are happy and fulfilled, I replied. They need to see adults who've figured out how to do meaningful work. They need examples of what it looks like to build a life around your values instead of other people's expectations. I could see something shifting in their faces. Not agreement, necessarily, but a kind of bewildered recognition that I wasn't backing down from positions they'd expected to easily overcome. Madison, Dad said, his voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before, we're just trying to help you avoid mistakes we see you making. But what if they're not mistakes? I asked. What if choosing work I love over work that maximizes income isn't a mistake? What if partnering with someone who shares my values instead of someone who can provide the most financial security isn't a mistake? Then you're gambling with your future, Mom said, and you're gambling with your happiness. I replied. We stared at each other across the table, across what felt like an unbridgeable philosophical divide. I need you both to understand something, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I'm not asking for your approval anymore. I'm not trying to convince you that my choices are right. I'm telling you what my boundaries are. They waited, clearly unsure what was coming next. I will not discuss changing careers anymore. I will not listen to criticisms of Jake or suggestions that I should find someone more practical. I will not defend my life choices or justify my happiness to earn your acceptance. Madison, Mom started, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished, I said. I love you both, and I want you in my life. But only if you can love me as I actually am. Not as the person you wish I'd become. We do love you as you are, Dad said. But his voice lacked conviction. No, I replied. You love the potential you see in me to become someone else. You love the daughter you could have if I made different choices. But you don't love the daughter who designs affordable housing and dates a public defender and finds joy in community impact over financial advancement. The truth of this settled between us like a weight. That has to change, I continued. Or we can't have a relationship that doesn't hurt both of us. You're being dramatic, Mom said. But her voice was shaky. I'm being honest, I replied. For the first time in my adult life, I'm being completely honest about what I need from this family. And what if we can't give you what you need? Dad asked, his voice tight with something that might have been grief. Then we'll have to figure out what kind of limited relationship we can have that doesn't damage any of us further. I said. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a goodbye simultaneously. Madison, Mom said, tears finally appearing in her eyes, we never meant to make you feel unloved. I know, I replied. And I meant it, but intent doesn't negate impact. And the impact of conditional love is that it doesn't feel like love at all. They sat across from me. My parents who had raised me and housed me and fed me and sent me to college, and I could see them grappling with the possibility that love and damage could coexist, that good intentions could create harmful outcomes, that their vision of helping me could actually be hurting me. We need time to think about this, Dad said finally. Take all the time you need. I replied. But understand that while you're thinking I'm going to keep living my life exactly as I've chosen to live it. I gathered up the photos and documents I'd brought, sliding them back into my folder like evidence being returned to a briefcase after a trial. I'm flying back to Portland this afternoon. I said. When you're ready to love me without conditions, let me know. I stood up from the table, leaving money for my portion of the meal, and walked away from the conversation that had been building for 7 years. Behind me, I could hear my mother beginning to cry. The weeks following the Chicago confrontation felt like living in a suspension bridge. Everything stable and familiar had shifted, but the new structure hadn't quite settled into place yet. I flew back to Portland that Sunday afternoon, my head buzzing with adrenaline and exhaustion, and found Jake waiting for me at baggage claim with coffee and the kind of hug that felt like coming home. How was the rest of it? He asked as we walked to his car, my weekend bag slung over his shoulder. I told him everything during the drive back to our house. The graduation ceremony that felt like performance art, the detailed presentation about my career change, the moment when I'd shown them my actual income and watched their assumptions crumble, the final conversation where I'd drawn boundaries I'd never articulated before. I'm proud of you, he said, as we pulled into our driveway, past the rose bush we'd planted together the previous spring. That couldn't have been easy. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, I admitted, and also the most necessary. That first week back, I threw myself into work with renewed energy. The community center project was entering its final phase, and I spent long days on site working with contractors to ensure every detail matched our community-centered vision. Being surrounded by the tangible results of my work, seeing families use spaces I'd designed, watching children play in areas I'd planned specifically for their needs, felt like the best possible reminder of why I'd fought so hard to protect this career. Jake and I talked every evening about what the new family dynamics might look like. We'd both grown up in complicated family systems, but his experience had been different from mine. His family's problems centered around financial stress and communication patterns, not fundamental disagreements about life values. Watching me navigate conditional love had been educational for him, but also disturbing. It's like they can't see who you actually are, he said one evening as we cooked dinner together in our small kitchen. They're so focused on who they think you should be that they miss who you are entirely. The weird part, I replied, chopping vegetables for our stir-fry, is that I think they genuinely believe they're helping me. In their framework, pushing me toward financial security and conventional success is an act of love. But they've never asked if you want that kind of help, Jake pointed out. Exactly. They've never asked what I actually need or want. They've just assumed their fears about my future are more important than my actual experience of my life. 2 weeks after Chicago, Carmen called me. We'd been texting regularly since her decision to take medical leave, but this was our first real conversation since the graduation weekend. How did it go with Mom and Dad? She asked, her voice tentative. I gave her a summary of the confrontation, the boundaries I'd set, and the silence that had followed. Madison, she said after a long pause, I need to tell you something. After you left Chicago, they called me. My stomach clenched. What did they say? They wanted me to talk to you. To convince you that you were throwing away opportunities and being stubborn about practical concerns. Carmen's voice carried exhaustion. They asked me to be a mediator. What did you tell them? I told them that maybe the problem wasn't your choices. Maybe the problem was their inability to respect those choices. She took a shaky breath. I told them that your career success and happiness with Jake prove that your decisions are working, and that trying to convince you to abandon what's working might say more about their insecurities than your mistakes. I felt a surge of gratitude so strong it brought tears to my eyes. How did they react? Not well, Carmen admitted. Dad said I was enabling your defiance, and Mom said I was too young to understand the complexities of long-term financial planning. I'm sorry they put you in that position. I said, don't be. It was actually helpful for me to see how they handle disagreement. When you don't automatically agree with their perspective, they don't try to understand yours, they just escalate the pressure until you comply or withdraw. Carmen's therapy was clearly helping her develop language for family dynamics we'd both experienced but never named. Madison, she continued. I want you to know that watching you set boundaries with them has been incredible for me. It's shown me that it's possible to love family members while protecting yourself from their dysfunction. How are you doing with all of this? I asked. Better, actually. Taking the pressure off graduating on schedule has helped my anxiety enormously. And my therapist and I are working on distinguishing between healthy achievement and perfectionism driven overwork. She paused. I'm learning that success doesn't have to feel like panic. Over the following month, the silence from my parents became its own kind of communication. No phone calls checking in on my work, no emails with articles they thought I should read, no invitations to visit or suggestions for weekend plans. At first, the quiet felt ominous, like the stillness before a storm. But gradually it began to feel peaceful. Without the constant low-level stress of managing their disapproval, I had energy for other relationships. Jake and I started hosting regular dinner parties for friends from work, turning our small dining room into a gathering space for conversations about architecture and social justice and the intersection between meaningful work and sustainable living. These evenings felt like the family dinners I'd always wanted, people celebrating each other's successes without competition, supporting each other through challenges without judgment, sharing ideas and dreams without fear of ridicule. My work flourished during this period too. Without the mental energy I'd been spending on family stress, I could focus more completely on my projects. The community center was featured in a national architecture magazine, leading to inquiries from other cities about similar developments. I was invited to speak at a conference about sustainable affordable housing, and several nonprofit organizations reached out about potential collaborations. Jake and I also began seriously planning our future in ways that felt joyful rather than defensive. We started looking at houses in neighborhoods we loved, researching school districts for future children, discussing how we'd balance careers and parenting. These conversations happened without the shadow of family disapproval that had previously made future planning feel like an argument I'd have to defend later. 3 months after Chicago, I received a text from my mother, "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time before calling Jake into the room. "What do you think?" I asked, showing him the text. "What do you want?" he replied. "I want to know if they've learned anything from the past 3 months," I said. "But I also want to protect the peace we've built." "You could ask what they want to talk about," Jake suggested. "Get a sense of their mindset before agreeing to a conversation." I texted back, "What would you like to discuss?" Her response came an hour later. "Your father and I have been doing a lot of thinking. We'd like to understand your perspective better." It wasn't an apology, but it also wasn't a renewed attempt to change my mind. I decided to take the risk. We arranged a video call for the following weekend. Jake offered to be nearby for support, which I gratefully accepted. When my parents appeared on the screen, they looked older than I remembered, and uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. "Madison," Mom began. "We want you to know that we've been reflecting on our conversation in Chicago. We realize," Dad continued, "that we may have been overly focused on our concerns about your future instead of listening to your actual experience." I waited, curious about where this was leading. "We did some research," Mom said, "into the kind of architecture work you do. We looked up articles about affordable housing design and community development. We also," Dad added, looking uncomfortable, "talked to a financial planner about different models of career success and retirement planning. We learned that there are more paths to financial security than we'd considered." This was more intellectual curiosity about my work than they'd shown in my entire adult life. "We want to understand," Mom said carefully, "what we got wrong and how we've approached your choices." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was an acknowledgement that their approach had been problematic. "I appreciate that you've been researching my work," I said. "What specifically did you learn that surprised you?" "We didn't realize," Dad said, slowly, "how significant the impact of your projects is on the communities where you work. We thought architecture was more about aesthetic choices than social outcomes." We also didn't realize, Mom added, how well respected you are in your field. The articles we found mentioned you specifically as an emerging leader in sustainable community design. Hearing them name my actual professional accomplishments felt surreal after years of conversations that treated my career as a hobby I'd outgrow. What about Jake? I asked. They exchanged glances. We talked to our neighbor whose son is a public defender in Seattle, Dad said. He helped us understand what public defense work actually involves and why it's important for the legal system. We realized, Mom added, that we'd been thinking about Jake's work in terms of income potential instead of social impact. We didn't understand that ensuring fair representation for people who can't afford attorneys is a fundamental part of how justice works. These weren't dramatic revelations, but they represented a willingness to learn about our actual lives instead of projecting their assumptions onto us. We want to try again, Dad said. We want to have a relationship with you that doesn't involve us trying to change your life choices. How would that work? I asked. We're not sure, Mom admitted. We're hoping you can help us figure that out. Over the following hour, we had the most honest conversation we'd ever had as a family. I explained how their constant suggestions for career changes and relationship improvements had felt like rejections of my authentic self. They acknowledged that their focus on conventional success markers had prevented them from seeing the success I'd actually achieved. We want to know more about your work, Mom said. Not to judge it or suggest improvements, but because we want to understand what you're passionate about. We want to get to know Jake better too, Dad added. As the person you love, not as someone we need to evaluate for his earning potential, and we want to learn how to be supportive without being controlling, Mom continued. We realize we don't know how to do that, but we want to learn. It wasn't a perfect conversation, and it didn't resolve years of accumulated hurt, but it was a beginning, the first time they'd approached our relationship from a place of curiosity rather than control. I'm willing to try, I said. Finally. But it has to be different this time. I won't go back to defending my choices or justifying my happiness. We understand, Dad said. We want to try being the kind of parents who celebrate your choices instead of questioning them. Even if we don't always understand them immediately, Mom added. 6 months later, my parents visited Portland for the first time. They stayed in a hotel downtown but spent most of their time at our house, helping Jake and I work in the garden, cooking meals together, asking genuine questions about our work and our neighborhood. The visit wasn't perfect. Old patterns don't disappear overnight, but it was profoundly different. When I showed them the community center I'd designed, they asked about the design process and the community input sessions, not about whether the project had led to higher paying opportunities. When Jake explained a case he was working on, they listened to understand the legal issues involved, not to evaluate whether his career was advancing fast enough. Most importantly, they seemed genuinely interested in getting to know us as we actually were, rather than as the people they thought we should become. We're proud of you, Mom said on their last evening, as we sat on our back porch watching the sunset. We should have said that years ago. We're proud of the work you do, Dad added. We're proud of the life you've built. We're proud of who you've become. Hearing those words felt like receiving something I'd stopped believing was possible. The transformation in our relationship didn't happen overnight, and it's still ongoing. But something fundamental shifted after Chicago, from a dynamic based on conditional love and constant improvement suggestions to one based on acceptance and genuine curiosity. Carmen graduated the following semester in a small ceremony that felt more meaningful than the large one she'd missed. My parents attended with pure pride, celebrating her courage in prioritizing her mental health and her academic achievement without treating either as a compromise. Jake and I got engaged that fall, and my parents' response was unqualified joy. They offered to help with wedding planning, and asked how they could support us, rather than using the engagement as an opportunity to revisit their concerns about our financial future. The most significant change, though, was in how I felt about myself and my choices. Without the constant low-level stress of family disapproval, I discovered energy and confidence I hadn't realized I'd been missing. My work became even more innovative and impactful when I wasn't carrying the emotional burden of justifying it to people who couldn't see its value. Jake and I bought a house in the neighborhood we'd always dreamed of living in. We started talking seriously about having children, not from a place of defensive planning but from excitement about raising kids in a community that values both creativity and social responsibility. The experience taught me that sometimes loving people requires protecting yourself from their dysfunction, and sometimes protecting yourself creates space for relationships to heal in ways that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Looking back now, I understand that my parents' conditional love came from their own fears and limitations, not from anything lacking in me. They'd been raised to believe that security required sacrifice, that financial stability was more important than personal fulfillment, that unconventional choices were inherently risky. But I also learned that understanding the source of harmful behavior doesn't mean you have to tolerate its impact. I could have compassion for their fears while refusing to let those fears control my life choices. The boundaries I set in Chicago weren't punishments or ultimatums. They were invitations for our relationship to become healthier. By refusing to participate in dynamics that hurt all of us, I created space for better dynamics to develop. Not every family story has this kind of resolution. Some parents can't or won't examine their own patterns. Some relationships can't survive the honesty that healthy boundaries require. But in my case, my parents' love was ultimately stronger than their need to control, and their willingness to learn was stronger than their attachment to being right. The most important lesson I learned through this whole experience was that you can't negotiate your way into unconditional love. Either people love you as you are, or they love the potential they see for you to become someone else. The difference between these two kinds of love is the difference between freedom and prison, between thriving and surviving, between authentic relationship and performance art. If you've ever felt like you have to choose between being yourself and being loved by your family, I want you to know that this is a false choice. Real love doesn't require you to become someone else. Real love celebrates who you already are while supporting your growth into who you want to become. And if you've ever been told that your career choices, your partner, your lifestyle or your values aren't practical enough for your family's approval, I want you to know that practicality without passion is its own kind of risk. The risk of spending your life fulfilling other people's dreams instead of your own. The risk of reaching the end of your life and realizing you never gave yourself permission to find out who you really were. The work I do now, designing spaces where families can build community, where children can play safely, where people who've been priced out of decent housing can live with dignity, this work matters. Not because it generates the highest possible income, but because it contributes to solving problems that keep me awake at night if I ignore them. Jake's work matters too. Every time he ensures fair representation for someone who can't afford a private attorney, he's protecting constitutional rights that make our democracy stronger. Every case he wins for someone the system wanted to dismiss strengthens justice for everyone. These aren't naive choices or immature priorities. They're informed decisions about how we want to spend our lives and what kind of impact we want to have on the world. For those of you watching who've experienced similar family dynamics, I want to say this: you don't have to earn love through achievement. You don't have to prove your worth through conventional success. You don't have to abandon your values to win approval from people who can't see the value in what you care about. You are allowed to choose work that fulfills you even if it doesn't maximize your income. You are allowed to partner with someone who shares your values even if they don't meet other people's criteria for stability. You are allowed to build a life around meaning and community impact, even if that life doesn't look like what your family had in mind for you. You are also allowed to set boundaries with family members who can't love you without conditions. You are allowed to protect your mental health and emotional well-being from people who claim to care about you while consistently undermining your confidence and happiness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a relationship is to stop participating in patterns that hurt everyone involved. Sometimes you have to create distance to make space for closeness that's actually healthy. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and if the people involved are willing to do the work, those boundaries create opportunities for relationships to heal and grow in ways that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. My relationship with my parents isn't perfect now, but it's real in a way it never was before. They see me as I actually am, not as the person they hoped I'd become. They celebrate my achievements because they understand what I'm trying to achieve, not because my success reflects well on them. They love Jake because they know him as a person, not because they've evaluated his earning potential and found it acceptable. They're excited about the life we're building together because they can see how happy and fulfilled we are, not because our choices match their template for success. This is what healthy family relationships can look like when everyone involved is willing to prioritize authenticity over comfort, growth over control, love over fear. If your family can't offer you this kind of love yet, that doesn't mean you're unworthy of it. It means they haven't learned how to love without conditions. And while you can't force them to learn, you can refuse to sacrifice your authentic self while waiting for them to figure it out. You can build chosen family with friends who celebrate your values. You can create community with people who understand your priorities. You can find mentors and role models who've walked similar paths and can show you what's possible when you refuse to compromise your core self for other people's approval. The life I have now, work that challenges and fulfills me, a partner who sees and loves my authentic self, relationships based on mutual respect rather than conditional approval. This life exists because I finally decided that being true to myself was more important than earning approval from people who couldn't love me as I actually am. That decision was the hardest thing I've ever done, and also the most liberating. To everyone watching who's struggling with similar choices, you deserve to be loved exactly as you are. You deserve relationships that celebrate your authentic self instead of trying to reshape you into someone else. You deserve to spend your life doing work that matters to you, surrounded by people who understand why it matters. And you deserve family relationships that support your growth instead of limiting it, that celebrate your happiness instead of questioning it, that love you for who you are instead of who they think you should become. If you don't have those relationships yet, start by being that kind of person for yourself. Start by loving and accepting your own choices, even when other people can't understand them. Start by prioritizing your own values, even when other people think they're impractical. The life you build from that foundation of self-acceptance will attract people who can love you authentically, and it will naturally distance you from people who can only love you conditionally. It won't be easy, but it will be real. And real love, even if it takes longer to find, is always worth waiting for. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether this story resonates with your own experiences. Have you ever had to choose between being authentic and being approved of? How did you navigate family relationships that felt conditional? What advice would you give to someone currently struggling with these dynamics? Subscribe if this kind of content helps you feel less alone in your own family challenges. There are so many of us out there who've had to learn the difference between love and control, between support and sabotage, between family and people who just happen to share your DNA. You're not alone in this struggle, and you're not wrong for wanting relationships that celebrate who you are instead of trying to change you into someone else. Your authentic self deserves love, support, and celebration. Don't settle for anything less.